Well, thanks for joining for another interview about people who are LGBT plus community in motorsport. And today I'm joined by another guest. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Hazel Southwell. I'm a motorsport journalist and have sort of worked broadly in motorsport for quite a while now. Yeah.
And the next question was going to be about what kind of involvement you've had in motorsport. So you're a journalist. You cover things such as typically electric with Inside Electric, but you also do some work with race fans, for example. And how far back does your
Yeah.
involvement with motorsport go? As like not only like a career, but also maybe as a fan.
So I got into motorsport. I was kind of always into like cars and mechanical things, much more than like anything else when I was a kid. And I started watching Formula One. Well, not quite sure when I started watching. The first race I can remember is in 1992. So, um, yeah, from when I was like quite a small child. Was always like a fan of it because, and particularly interested in like the technology and how the cars actually worked. Obviously, the racing is super exciting as well, but like was always maybe more interested or not, at least equally interested in the engines as like the on-track action. Um, but I have also always been sort of quite environmentally minded, and kind of like I actually think this is the case for a lot of car journalists, but I am like broadly anti-cars on quite a lot of levels. So yeah, I kind of didn't necessarily see petrol-powered motorsport as something that I necessarily wanted to kind of like throw myself into. um, or something where I could sort of see myself existing. I had done like a few bits of work around motorsport, but it wasn't really until Formula E came along that I was like, okay, this is finally like that moment that can kind of reconcile really, really loving this and being interested in the technology, and also because I was already a journalist doing other stuff, the stuff I like doing is kind of like basically explaining and communicating and kind of getting, I can look into the exact specifics of how an electric propulsion system works and then hopefully explain it to people in a way that's kind of accessible and whatever, and hopefully funny occasionally.
It's not like that. There's a group of you that are all pals who do content creation. So for yourself, you're more the journalist side of things. But in terms of content creation, you've also got the likes of Chain Bear, who you've appeared in several of the prediction challenges for in the past,
Mm.
and the bingo that we I don't think we ever saw what the outcome of that was. But
Yeah, I think the bingo recording session. Uh, Yeah, I do not envy Stuart the task of trying to put together. I think it was like 2.25 hours of like us all slowly losing our minds more and more. So it's probably best if that is buried forever. But yes, yeah, I do. So in terms, I tend to think of myself as like a written journalist, but actually, like these days, that kind of doesn't exist as a role. So I do quite a lot of video work, like some of for Formula E, or with Formula E, like on documentary stuff. Like they're doing something that's a bit like Drive to Survive. Because all motorsport series have to do that now. And yeah, like do sort of various bits of filming work and stuff. And yeah, YouTube stuff and podcasts, and it's quite. I have like quite a strange relationship to it. I was kind of trying to force myself to do a bit more YouTube, and I've kind of accepted that I'm never going to actually edit videos myself. Like I just don't do it. I don't have time. It's not something I'm especially good at, and like although I can do it, it's just like easier not to. So I'm kind of now looking at sort of doing sort of planning in stuff way ahead and then making sure that I have the budget to get someone else to edit it and stuff. Because yeah, it's kind of easy to put a lot of pressure on yourself to kind of try and be an expert or like try and be good at everything, and it's like I'm actually not. Like the thing I can do is write, but I can't be like able to understand, I don't know, automotive and motorsport across multiple series and stuff, and be on top of all the news cycle, and be processing interviews, and be doing stuff, and also like, be brilliant at graphic design. Like, there's a reason that people are specialists in these things because they're actual skills. So yeah, sorry, I've just kind of gone off on one there, but it's weird. Like, the role of journalist has become so non-specific that I think it was something definitely kind of like, especially starting out in motorsport, I had to kind of actually think like, no, I need to pull this back and like make sure that I'm focusing on what I actually want to do, not kind of like letting myself get pulled in loads of different directions and not do any of them very well.
And that's like, well, one of the big things that's like affected your career, isn't it? Because with Formula E, for example, you were there from the outset. What I was going to be largely talk about, like I said at the top of this interview, is what I'm trying to cover as part of, well, Pride Month is a good kind of springboard for it, is being part of the LGBTQ plus community in motorsport. And my next question is just, how do you feel that being part of that community has affected your career in journalism, or just within the world of motorsport?
Yeah, for me, it's a really interesting question because, like, when I decided to move into doing more motorsport work, I was already out. Like, I was in my late 20s when Formula E, kind of appeared. So it wasn't a choice where I could kind of like put it back in the box. And it also wasn't something I would have been willing to do. So yeah, I kind of, for me, it was very much, um, I guess I was aware that motorsport was a very conservative world compared to like where I'd been working in like BBC radio and stuff. Um, but I wasn't. Um, I think I initially it was a shock to me that people were shocked that I was like more openly or obviously LGBT, um, than in a way where it didn't ever occur to me in like my normal life that my identity was in any way controversial. Um, because like it hadn't been to me for many many years. Like, my mum has a go at me about it occasionally, but like she has a go at me about everything. So um, um yeah, it kind of wasn't. Yeah, it did really surprise me that people, basically, that I entered a world where a lot of people had never met an openly queer person at all. um or like maybe they had and they could like list the number of times they had, kind of thing, because there were so few of us around. And it's not that there are none. There definitely are other, particularly in Formula E. I think we're a bit more like generally, um, we are like a younger and overall more liberal series than Formula One. And of course, there are out people in Formula One as well. Um, but yeah, it, it was quite a surprise to me to, in the 2010s, find this world where stuff like, and this is a really like pathetic example, but like it never occurred to me, um in like halfway through season three, I like shaved one side of my head, um which is just a hairstyle. It's a fairly sort of like aggressively queer coded hairstyle, but it is just a hairstyle, and it really didn't occur to me that that would ever be sort of considered. I wasn't doing it to be edgy. I didn't think it was like an edgy thing to do because it's just hair. And yeah, like sort of people were very like, woo. um, um, because it was sort of more, I guess, overt. And yeah, it sort of it did it took me a bit aback that like I knew it was a conservative world into which I didn't necessarily fit directly, but it's like every time you sort of realize quite how far away you are from the mold, is quite can be quite shocking. I mean, I kind of always, I guess I've never been that bothered about sort of um becoming someone else, but because I was older and because I was kind of I guess more assured in my own identity than maybe a younger person might have been when I came into motorsport. It kind of didn't um it never occurred to me to kind of tone it down. But I think definitely had I been younger, that definitely would have been the impression I got, and I also would have. I think there's a situation when you're in a world and like there aren't any other people like you in that world. It can feel very sort of I mean, yeah, literally alienating and kind of you have to have an incredibly certain idea of your own place in it and why you're there. And like I would say, I mean, in a way, being queer doesn't in any way affect what I do in a paddock. Like, it doesn't affect my job. It doesn't affect or it doesn't affect how I write, probably. Um, Although, actually, that's not true. Like, it's weird. It's like, it doesn't affect it, but actually, it does in the sense that, like, I have a completely different lens of seeing the world compared to, like, completely straight journalists. Because yeah, there just is a difference in perspective, and it's the same difference in perspective if like someone comes from the US or someone comes from the UK, they have different perspectives on life because they have a different experience of life. You know, it's not like some unique trait to being LGBT, but it is something that like does mean that you have a so for instance when I look at a paddock and as a journalist and there's no out people in it, I'm like, okay, what's wrong here? Like, and and that kind of thing. Rather because it sticks out to me that there aren't any people like me. Um, Whereas, yeah, other people might not necessarily immediately kind of identify that as a thing because you don't if you if you're not aware of it yourself, then it doesn't necessarily kind of stand out in the same way. Um, but yeah, to a large extent, you know, a drivetrain doesn't care who I want to kiss when I'm looking at it, provided it's not the drivetrain itself, which is like bad idea. But like it's something where because motorsport and sport in general is a very intense environment and you're very much kind of like you know, people talk about the circus, the family, and if you're feeling like the freak in the circus, then that will always kind of play into um how you have to manage things and how you have to do stuff. There's a lot of, you know, in any sport there's a lot of like mental confidence stuff for anyone who works in it, not just for the athletes. And I think that knowing you have a sort of potential vulnerability that no one else or that only a handful of other people have can feel kind of yeah like a little bit like you're more exposed than other people. But I have to say actually like I've never really faced kind of like anything particularly nasty. Um, and there's a lot of like I really appreciate that because I am out, and proud about it. I do know that I get like a lot of people who want to be journalists and or want to work in motorsport, but want to kind of like be themselves within motorsport. Like, you know, I get a lot of people asking me about it. I get a lot of people who follow my work because they know I'm not gonna drop like some homophobic clangers or like say something transphobic because they know who I am. Um, and like there is a sort of security to that and a trust, which is, we talk a lot about people don't trust journalists anymore, um, which is our fault. Um, so yeah, it's always been kind of like a complicated thing for me to exist in motorsport with it because obviously like you don't you don't go to motorsport to pick people up, but you don't also suspend your identity at the door because like people who and anyone who believes that is actually just saying that their identity is the one that is presumed to be normal and anything else is assumed to be kind of extra, and it's like, well, being queer is not kind of like being a straight person with a few bolt-ons that I can just like throw off. Like everyone has to be allowed to like bring their whole selves to a large extent.
And in addition to that, one of the other things I can think about is I remember there was an article you wrote, I think last year, about when you went to Diriyah and for the
Mm.
E Prix. And do you also feel that just existing in that kind of space, again, Formula E different to Formula One, different to something like if you were covering the W Series or Extreme E or anything like that? Do you think that being a woman in motorsport also impacts how people perceive you?
I think yeah, it's there's no question that being a woman in motorsport media really stands out, especially like because you can get I don't want to say a skewed perception of it, but when you look at motorsport broadcasts, you actually see quite a lot of women doing interviewing and stuff. Um, so you would get the impression that actually there are like fairly even numbers of journalists. Sadly, that is just not the case. It is much more equal in broadcast. So you have like excellent journalists like Rachel Brooks working in F1 very prominently, and Jenny Gow and people, and naturally they're adding more and more women to the broadcast teams at FOM and some of the kind of contracted broadcasters. And of course, in Formula E, we have Nikki, and yeah, so you don't necessarily realize that. Um, no, I got a really interesting DM the other day from someone who was like, I've watched lots of F1 press conferences because they're televised now or because they put them out on YouTube, or they put some of them out. And the person who DM'd me was like, "Do women ever ask questions?" And I was like, "Oof," because like the truth is, I have transcribed every press session for this season, I think, or at least I've listened to it, working for race fans, and I don't think a woman has asked a question, because I don't think there have been any women in them, um, for various reasons. It's partly because the F1 media is restricted at the moment to only people with a full season pass, what's called a permanent pass. Um, and I don't know how many, if any, women have one of those. Um, I think I think a lot of female journalists were sort of event by event accredited. I have one in Formula E, but I think I may be the only female journalist with one. I certainly am in Formula E, but I don't know for sure about other series, but I suspect it is the case. So it's not just that you're in a minority, it's that you are in such a tiny minority as a woman in the media center that like probably comfortably there could have been like, I mean, I'm sure there were a lot of races last year where there were no women in attendance in the media center, because of, COVID and stuff. And it's pretty easy for that to be the case. It does affect things. There's a sort of, I mean, there's just a lot of people who just do not believe that you're credible if you're a woman. There's a lot of people who will. I find it very frustrating. I am a tech journalist mostly, and like I write about technical things for the most part. Um, and people kind of assume that I will be interested in like gossipy stuff, which like I'm actually really not. Or that I write kind of like fluffy pieces, um, which like I know why. It's because I'm a woman, and they think that would be what I'm interested in, but it isn't at all. And if you look at my work, like it's very clear which way I kind of lean, which is like, a lot more fuel on the broken down to a molecular level than it is kind of like, I don't know, driver rumors. Um, like I am the absolute last person to know who any of them are dating. But people quite often imagine that I would. Um, but yeah, I think some things that I think people imagine are very hard, I don't find too hard. So traveling is inherently dangerous. Traveling alone is inherently a little bit more dangerous. And some of the ways that you have, or especially traveling alone on a budget, which if you're a freelance journalist, the money is always coming out of whatever you earn. So like you have to think about that. Um, yeah, it's scrappy, and I've done some things, especially in Riyadh, where I'm like, well, that's pretty questionable. Um, but I I think um I think for me, I don't want to say I'm foolhardy or that I'm not worried about safety concerns. I am, and I think that I have like a fairly good handle on it. I've traveled a lot by myself, and I've done kind of much more dangerous jobs in terms of the situation for working in. So I think I can kind of cope with it fairly well. I think for some women that would be the risks are too much. Um, and I think that's completely fair. Like, um, not a lot of people would spend like 18 nights sleeping in airports in a single season. Um, but like, yeah, there's a lot of casual sexism, um, which is like just like mind-bogglingly bad misogynist jokes in a kind of like, I think I've mostly kind of stamped it out in Formulary, or at least people don't do it in front of me anymore. But like there's a lot of it. And also like, yeah, you're always aware that you're not one of the boys to some extent. Like I know I won't be invited to the pub for a beer or whatever. And that you just have to learn to kind of be able to handle yourself with that, and not take it personally, or be too bothered. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm there to work, not make friends, so it doesn't really matter. But it is, yeah, it's a different experience.
And from these two experiences and through like a kind of intersectional understanding, people would
Mm.
consider members of the LGBTQ plus community or women in motorsport as activists. This is something when I was speaking to Richard Morris of Racing Pride, he's recently been talking about how he doesn't feel like his existence should be considered activism. I was wondering what kind of thoughts you have on that sentiment.
Um, so yeah, it is. It's that thing of um, visibly existing in a world where both you are presumed not to exist, and um, where there aren't very many of you, will always kind of be an act of activism. And I kind of I have a very difficult relationship with the idea of being like inspirational. I don't I don't think anyone should be inspired by me really. Mostly things I do are like incredible lessons in how not to do things. Um, but I am aware that like as somebody, you're immediately an ambassador, and you immediately have to represent more than yourself. So it's like any woman in motorsport has the whole reputation of women in motorsport kind of riding on her shoulders. So like if you get a go in a junior series or something, then there might be 23 other drivers, all of whom do not have like, well, she has to prove that girls can do this or whatever. Um, like if a male junior driver doesn't make it to F1, nobody goes like, well, that's proof that men should not be in F1. But you know that that's kind of the lens that it will often be framed through. Um, with when it comes to women, and there's a similar thing with LGBT people, and it's the same thing a lot of the time. You're constantly proving something. Either you're proving that you can do it, um, or you're, or worse, you're kind of like on a good day you're proving that it's a success, and on a bad day, which we all have, you're proving it's a failure. The problem is that when you feel like you're in this kind of like very high pressured ambassador role by default of existing and being who you are, um, there is that additional pressure, and like it's it's very weird because I never really thought of myself as like particularly a representative of anyone. Um, but now, yeah, I can't. I don't know. It's definitely something where in the past year I've sort of realized I have to kind of take it a bit more seriously on that front, and be sort of more aware of myself as more than myself. Um, because yeah, there's other people who I need to represent, and I need to kind of show what we can do and what we can contribute to the to motorsport and to journalism at large. Um, and there is a bit of me, of course, that resents that if I wasn't me, then, or if I was someone who is more generally accepted, if I was more like, very, very typical motorsport journalist, then I wouldn't have to think about that and I wouldn't have to do that work. But it is what it is. And I think, journalism kind of should be activism anyway. So there's a sort of, we're not press officers. Uh, So there's always like that tension, but it's something where I think the frustration is not being able to turn it off, because it's like wanting to represent something on your good days is it feels fine, and on your bad days you're like, I don't want this. I don't want the weight of knowing that people think like it's not just journalist screws up. It's like Getty journalist screws up or whatever, you know. Um, and yeah, it can kind of eat you a bit. But I am also aware that it means a lot to people, and that like it's not enough to, as we've seen with the diversity initiatives in motorsport, like, you know, We Race as One and whatever, they look very, very hollow if there's no explicit statements, which, you know, Formula E's equivalent, Positively Charged, was absolutely embarrassing. I really hope we've dropped it, because it was so vague, that it stood for absolutely nothing. Um, and you know, I guess that specifically existing as yourself and that being a kind of activism is saying it out loud. You know, it's saying it is actually good and important for LGBT people to be in motorsport. It's good and important for women to be in motorsport. Like, if you walk into a room and everybody is the same white man, that is an issue. Um, so yeah, I think it's something where like I don't know. I quite struggle with like just existing and people knowing that I exist. Um, I have a powerful millennial desire not to be perceived. Um, but like yeah, I think it's a difficult thing to sort of get your head around and balance perfectly. Um, but ultimately, I hope, you know, we'll see in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, maybe even just a few years' time, that it will stop being that kind of inherent activism, that we will see that there are simply, it will stop being a novelty, um, or stop being something new to see openly LGBT people in motorsport, to see women taking on journalist roles, to see women taking on broader roles across motorsport. Um, and I hope that when we get to that point, like, you know, because diversity isn't having like a couple of people and saying like, well, we've ticked the box, we've got a couple of people. It's about building the environment where you could have many, or where you can actually create like a genuinely diverse um, cohort of people that are working in the sport. So yeah, I hope, and I'm a little bit hopeful, because you can see that the numbers are shifting generally. There are more women. Um, there are more openly LGBT people. There are, you know, you're seeing more people of color, because like there has been a bit of reflection in within motorsport. Um, and you know, when I first started working in motorsport, looking back to like 2014, did I ever imagine that a Formula One car would have a Pride logo on it? No. Because it just seemed impossible. But like, you know, that now seems like, I mean, it's awesome that that's going to happen at the French Grand Prix this weekend. And it's also, you know, something that feels almost overdue, or like way overdue. And I think the energy that these things are overdue, and that everyone kind of, you know, the motorsport environment needs to normalize to society, is that's that's actually very cool to see, and it feels like progress is being made.
And that brings me on to my next kind of main question, which is, what kind of changes have you seen or felt over your career regarding being part of the LGBT plus community in motorsport. Like Racing Pride is a good example of that, where it's now going to be on an F1 car. You talked about Positively Charged, the Formula E initiative, which also pledged to have more representation of underrepresented groups in the presenting team, and Formula One's We Race as One program, which is still being ironed out in terms of the policies in it. But what kind of tangible changes have you personally seen or felt in your career in motorsport?
Um, so when I was working for working in Formula One, but not in sort of in Formula One more than like kind of for a team. Um, Years ago, I was in a meeting and a dude sat down next to another dude and said no homo because he had sat on the same bench. And I was just like, what on earth? Like just the level of kind of like it was just epic levels of cringe. But that was kind of where things were at the time. And I know that there has been improvements. Um, there are things have changed quite a lot. I think mostly in ways that aren't necessarily particularly visible. So it's really cool that we have Racing Pride. It's really cool that we have better representation generally. So like if someone wants to say where are the LGBT racing drivers, then it's like well, you can list them. Like they are there now. Um, and I think that's really cool and that's great for visibility kind of within and outside of the sport. Um, but I think also there's been sort of a lot of kind of behind the scenes sort of shifts, a lot of which is to do with um, social media, uh, since that's become more of a focus. Like the internet is not, I mean, the internet is awful, obviously, and like social media is full of just like the worst people in history. Um, but also there is a wider community there, and you can't kind of you can't tell millions of Gen Zs that like you're not gonna look at the fact that there's no representation and that like there's an expectation now that any product that any offering will be inclusive. You see it with for anywhere from like Marvel movies to uh, I'm now struggling to think of literally any other films, but Star Wars. There we go. Um, uh, but yeah, like you see it kind of in terms of the way people want to consume media and want to look at media that they feel is representative, and sports comes into that. The sports broadcasts and sports media should have representation, and it's something that people just expect. Um, I think, uh, you know, it's no longer acceptable to. I think there are very few sort of motorsport fans out there who would find some of the pretty terrible locker room jokes that I have heard in any way acceptable. And I think that is something where like the scrutiny of all of that is important because there's ultimately a point that will always be the one that moves motorsport, and that's when it starts costing it money or losing it money in some way, missing out on something. And if you're turning people off because you aren't willing to to consider diversity and to make an environment where you actively say this is cool for LGBT fans to engage with. We won't. You are welcome here, and like we're not gonna make those jokes, and um we're not gonna fail you. Then like you are missing out on a chunk of fans. You're missing out not just on LGBT people, but people who care about LGBT people, which is actually a very substantial portion of the population. So as soon as you have it flagged that maybe it's not always that great in terms of representation or whatever, it's like you've got to do something about it, because you're creating just an endless problem otherwise.
And when we're talking about these things like changes in over the past, even over the past kind of like few years, what kind of changes do you personally want to see or feel that needs to happen in motorsport for wider inclusivity, acceptance, and diversity?
I think it's something where um, the reflection needs to be on understanding why it is not currently inclusive, which a lot of people don't get. So a lot of people sort of say like, well, nothing is stopping women and LGBT people coming in. There's no like specific legislature that says you can't do this, which is naivety, of course. Like, everything needs to be looked into, like, why aren't those people being reached out to by recruiters? Like, we know that, um, like, why aren't people of color and women getting roles within teams? Why is the best candidate always this specific sort of person? Like, why aren't there more people from like more diverse backgrounds within motorsport? It will enrich the sport to have a more diverse cohort of people working in it. Um, and we've got to look at what are the barriers, like why aren't people applying for the jobs if they're not applying for the jobs? Like, why aren't people engaging with it? How can we make sure that people do want to? And how can we make sure that that all kind of interlinks and ultimately delivers like a safe, welcoming environment within the paddock? Because at the end of the day, everyone wants to do their job, um, and beyond the paddock as well. Because the ecosystem of motorsport is everyone watching at home, is everyone, it has to be, part of the broadcast, part of the ways that everyone interacts with it. Um, and I think, yeah, it's going to be there has to be a process of reflecting on on what those barriers are, why the majority of people in motorsport are an incredibly specific type of white Western straight man, which is like, that is a very small, narrow proportion of like the world. Um, and and then look at what what can be done to change that. And there's all kinds of things where it's just like, okay, we can just be better. So like, let's knock gross gay jokes in the media center on the head of like right now. Like, that's not an acceptable standard of behavior. Um, and then there's the more complex things where it's about looking at, if we know, for instance, and we do know this, that there are lots of LGBT fans of motorsport, why aren't they then filtering into jobs in motorsport? Or why do they feel that they can't express their identity within a paddock? Or like, all of these questions. And those are ones where it's like, okay, probably all of us can think of like a couple of reasons off the top of the head. A lot of which is just that you can't see LGBT people, so people assume that they can't be. But it has to be, in any of this, you can't just like knee jerk and go like, well, we're gonna recruit like a gay person and then it's fixed. You've got to always, and influence the stuff, although sometimes it can be effective, it has to be meaningful. Um, so I think, yeah, it's one of those things where it needs to be a really thought out process of looking at the environment and why, because motorsport can be really harsh even to the narrow group of people that work in it. There's lots of problems with staff burnout and well-being and sort of people under incredible pressure. So, and I think everyone, including the existing people who work in motorsport, will benefit from reflecting on it and how the environment can be improved. Um, we want to see the best competition. We want to see everyone able to provide the best. So the best athletes, the best cars, the best tracks, the best events. Um, and we need to look at that as something where you want to support people to do that and to make sure that you have the best people for that. Not where it's kind of something that chews people up and spits them out, because that's not the best way to run stuff. So yeah, I think in terms of changes I want to see, I want to see serious thought put into it more than yeah, it's got to be a long sort of reflective organic process, which looks at why how things are now, why things are like that now, and what meaningful changes we can start to progress in terms of reaching out to more people and making sure that those shifts are permanent and meaningful.
And my final question before we start to wrap things up is, what changes do you see will be coming in the next 5 to 10 years? Will it be just more visibility? So something like the Racing Pride logo, we'll see more Pride logos coming in. I mean, we've seen NASCAR's engaged with it the past couple of years. W Series did the past couple of years, but it hasn't this year. I think IndyCar as well. We see it. We've seen the Pride flag on the side pods of cars for this year.
Yeah.
Where do you see motorsport going in the next 5 to 10 years?
So I think there'll be more of that. I think we will start to see, there's always been this slightly bizarre argument that a driver could never come out because they'd lose sponsors. Which, like, when you think about the companies that sponsor F1 teams, like, I feel as though, like, okay, maybe, I don't know, Philip Morris or Marlboro or whatever might not care if they looked bad for dropping a team for having a gay driver, but they kind of have a pretty bad image generally. Um, but uh, even then, I actually think that would be really painful. Like they would take such a PR kicking. Like even as a company that knowingly makes cigarettes, um, they would, and there's plenty of LGBT people who smoke. Um, there's, they would take such a kicking if Coca-Cola dropped um a driver for being gay. Like it's just inconceivable that this would happen. Like you can't. Any brand would be shredded if they did it. Um, and and so like that, I you can't force someone to come out. I have no idea what the identities of any of the drivers are, or any of the drivers who will come up in the next 5 years are. Um, but like I think we will probably see more prominent drivers. Just statistically, it's very unlikely that there aren't any in the top classes, and or that there won't be any. Um, and I think we'll also yeah, more visibility. It will be much more normalized to include pride. Like now we're like, and like I won't lie, I got a bit choked up about the idea of like a pride logo on an F1 car because I was like, this is something that even as myself a progressive person, I kind of imagined would never happen. Um, so yeah, we'll definitely we'll see more of it. We'll see more kind of comfort with it. And I hope, you know, there'll be there'll be generally a more friendly environment um towards LGBT people. I think I think the obvious point everyone kind of wants to get to is like people are not assumed to be straight and cis and whatever. Where everyone's identity is an identity. Um, and where, you know, if you are straight, then like you're straight versus gay or bisexual or pansexual or asexual or whatever. Um, but like that is a label as well, you know, like so we move away from the idea of like straightness as normal, or the default. And I think yeah, that's something that society in general is not there yet. But I think particularly within younger groups, that's much more normalized, and that is something that generationally will gradually change within motorsport as well. And I hope actually that um, because it's a platform where it has a presence and you know wants to reflect fans, that it will be maybe something that happens faster within sports than necessarily within the wider world. But I think, yeah, I mean, the big changes will be if we get someone prominent coming out, um, and I think that will be a really sort of watershed moment um, for being LGBT within motorsport. And I hope, you know, if someone does, then I think as much as there's no getting around it, they will get some nasty stuff. But I hope I think I overwhelmingly like the sport is ready for that.
Excellent. Thank you for joining me, Hazel. And if people are watching this today and want to go on and follow you on any social media, what would be the best way for them to be following you?
So you can read my awful tweets, most of which are now about my Twingo, um, at H Southwell FE. Um, and yeah, that's probably the best way of keeping up with whatever terrible dad content I'm posting.
Well, thank you for that, and all the best with the coverage for Formula E, Formula One, and beyond.
Thank you so much for having me.